tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
My friend Avi Yamini, who is a contributor to Rebel News, just landed in Israel. He's going to be covering, doing some reporting from the ground. And one of the things that he noted in his video I saw was that he was expecting to get on an empty plane going to Tel Aviv from wherever he was flying. But in fact, he got on a plane that was full because people want to be with their families. They want to be in the country that matters a great deal to them. And there is a bit of inspiration we can all take from that. Now, of course, none of that is apparent in the Canadian media coverage or much of the Western media coverage, for example. CBC, you may have seen, had sent a memo out to its journalists urging them to not call Hamas a terror organization, to not refer to Hamas as a terror group. Now, let me say there are a number of things in journalism that you have to include both sides of. Hamas is, as a matter of fact and a matter of law in Canada, a terrorist entity. This is something that is a long-standing and really uncontested designation as a list of terror organizations in Canada that includes Hamas. But to CBC, you cannot call them that. You're also not supposed to reference the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza by Israel, which took place in 2005, nearly 20 years ago. So any claim that Israel is occupying Gaza is simply untrue. But you're not going to see that reflected in CBC coverage. This memo sent out by the editorial standards director for the public broadcaster is one of the more explicit examples of this bias against Israel in its reporting of the Middle East, but by no means exclusively so, which is why Mike Fegelman always has his work cut out for him. He is the executive director of Honest Reporting Canada, which tries to keep the media responsible on this issue, and he joins me now. Mike, it's good to talk to you again. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me on your program, Andrew.
So this CBC memo, which I'm very grateful was leaked because it allows us to see very explicitly the marching orders that are being given. But I'm guessing you, just from reading coverage that CBC has published, could probably have indicated this was either an internalized bias or a matter of policy in their coverage already, right?
Well, it's a systemic issue where our public broadcaster, again, taxpayer dollars, refuses to call terror by its name. Andrew, as you point out, the Canadian government deems that Hamas is a terrorist organization. This isn't subjective. This is a matter of fact. But our public broadcaster is instructing its journalists to bend over backwards to sanitize terror and not call it for what it really needs to be called. The second component is in terms of not regarding Israel's pullout, disengagement from Gaza. They're basically saying, no, this is really effectively still an occupation. Israel controls the land, sea, and air. Whereas in reality, up until a couple of days ago, when Hamas had kidnapped about 100 plus people, there were no Israelis in Gaza, not settlers, not soldiers. This is what's actually happening on ground. So when you ask, is our public broadcaster, is there an inherent bias? This is very clear.
Well, and we also have seen some reporters in the past push back against what they believe is a too pro-Israel bias that exists in the media. I know a couple of years ago, there was this bizarre open letter that was being signed in which you had activist journalists saying that outlets should actually adopt the activist language. They should call it an occupation. They should call it illegal. They should accuse Israel of war crimes. And that was revealing of the sensibility of where a lot of individual reporters in Canada lie on this issue.
Yeah, and I think certainly in the past couple of years, we've noticed there's a shift in journalism where a lot of journalists who are tasked to be politically neutral and objective are shifting into becoming activists. Even though they're under the payroll of either our public broadcaster or other media outlets, we're flagging journalists who constantly inserting their personal opinion and personal political views into their coverage. That makes it jaundiced, that makes it slanted, and that fits their own political narrow viewpoint. It is very alarming.
Yeah, and just to go back to this memo from CBC here, they say, please make sure you don't use loaded language. And it goes on in that same paragraph, everything we say and write publicly as CBC journalists can be seen as part of our coverage and should be fact-based. So we go back to the Hamas designation. The fact that Hamas is a registered and designated terrorist group in Canada is a fact. So by not including that, they're undermining what they say is a commitment to, the old just the facts, ma'am line.
Yeah, they need to call a spade a spade. Public Safety Canada, our government, deems Hamas, I think it was 20 years ago, I think it was over 20 years ago declared Hamas a terror group, but they refuse to call it as such. There's also hypocrisy in the CBC's coverage of whether it's the Area D bombing. They have no problem appropriating the term and its variants: terror, terrorism, terrorist, but not as it relates to Hezbollah, the Lebanese terror group, not as it relates to ISIS, even Al-Qaeda, Hamas. No, they prefer to use language like fighter, insurgents, militants, the most sanitized language you could possibly imagine. And imagine you're a reader, a listener, a viewer. You can't really tell who these people actually are. In some respect, it almost comes off like their actions are legitimate when they're whitewashed in such a horrible way.
One of the things that I've always found so difficult about this issue is that you are having to deal with 7 decades. I mean, you're dealing with millennia of history, but if you're just talking about the state of Israel, you're dealing with, 7+ decades of history, which, if you've not been following it on the ins and outs, and even if you have been, is very difficult to condense into a few sentences of background in a story. And as a result, a lot of misinformation tends to be disseminated very easily. And I mean, I know you're well aware of this. People may have seen this map or it's a series of maps that purports to show, Israeli land grabs from Palestinians. And it's probably one of the most easily debunked and historically inaccurate maps. But you see this held up on signs. You see media outlets, in some cases, referencing it. The New York Times a few years back did this. And do you think this is an example of, in most cases, incompetence or bias? Do you think it's just journalists that don't know history, that don't know geopolitics, that are just being fed information from faulty sources? Or do you think it is that pushing an agenda?
Yeah, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I do think it is a healthy combination of both. I think there are certainly some journalists where there is an element of malice, where there's an intention to malign and to mislead. And then I think there's lots of people, there's no shortage of ignorance and naivete who accept the slanted political views and falsehoods as being conventional wisdom when they're not, and are willing, instead of doing their due diligence and fact checking and confirming the veracity of simple information that you can find with the click of a button on Google, they refuse to do so. Or maybe there's just a lack of editorial vigor and due diligence. In any event, the resulting effect is that people are misled. And this fundamentally changes paradigms about Israel, the Middle East, Canadian attitudes, Canadian foreign policy. It's debilitating.
One of the things that I am always encouraged by is that you do seem to get traction when you raise these issues from a lot of media outlets. They'll issue corrections, they'll change reporting, and I'm wondering if that's happening more or less frequency. Are you finding it's harder to get those corrections and concessions when you point out these issues?
It's a mixed bag, and it's always going to be case by case. We found that there are certain media outlets who are more amenable to professional dialogues, and then there are others who, quite frankly, are obtuse and, I'll be honest, provide a bit of a window dressing of journalistic accountability. I think, referencing the CBC, it's a perfect example where a public broadcaster is far too often reluctant to atone for journalistic transgressions. Other media outlets we found are open to a dialogue. It's a systemic issue, though.
Yeah, and just to use CBC as an example, one of the things that has happened with them is I'm talking to myself now. I believe we have lost Mike, so we'll have to get Mike back here in just a moment. But I should say, I mean, the CBC example, it was a leaked memo. Yes, it was a memo that was published, that was disseminated, and that was reported on. And at first, there were people saying, oh, we don't know if this is true or not. When asked for comment, CBC completely owned up to it. They completely bought the fact that, this is what we believe. This is who we are. And we stand by it. So CBC is a great example here, where as a matter of policy, they are choosing to take a very biased anti-Israel view, which is to say that we are going to whitewash the terrorism of Hamas. And that's the thing. And when I mentioned yesterday on the show, and I'll repeat it for those who missed it, or I'll say it louder for those at the back, you cannot both sides a conflict in which one side is a terrorist group attacking civilians. You cannot just talk about this as though there are two belligerents in a conflict like some state-on-state war. This is a case where you have a terrorist insurgent group that is attacking Israeli civilians, attacking children, seniors, women, doesn't matter, and doing absolutely brutal things to them. And by the way, I will mention one of the challenges yesterday. I had acknowledged that there had been this report from I-24, an Israeli reporter, in which she quoted IDF soldiers as saying they had seen evidence of babies being beheaded. This has become just an absolute, brutal debate online about, oh, well, did it actually happen? And her only evidence is what an IDF said. And I qualified that on the show, but I said, look, I've seen photos that suggest this stuff has gone on. And, look, I would love for it to not be true. I would absolutely love for no infants to have gone through what that reporter and what the soldiers with whom she spoke described happening. But the reality is, it is entirely plausible. It has the ring of truth. Like anything in a conflict, you have to verify and avoid the tendency to just buy into memes, buy into information which is traveling at breakneck speeds and can't be verified. But it's something that I think it's interesting how many people are trying so hard to say it's not true definitively, because they know how difficult it will be for them to keep up the narrative and rhetoric they're keeping up, which is whitewashing Hamas's crimes, if in fact this ends up becoming even more verified than it is. And I'll ask you about that, Mike. We have Mike Fegelman back from Honest Reporting Canada. I mean, obviously information's coming at breakneck speeds. Media outlets, I believe, do have an important role in sharing both sides of the conflict here. And if there are people in Canada that are rallying because they oppose Israel, I think their voices should be included for context. Where do you draw the line, though? Because I know you've raised criticism about the platforming of some of these people.
We draw the line when individuals are given a platform to justify terrorism. And listen, if it's a live interview and something is said that, whether it's calling for Jews to be decapitated, you got to call that out. You got to say this is just abhorrent. What we're seeing far too often are column inches, reporting, airtime given to people who are saying, look, it's because of the settlements, because of the so-called occupation of Gaza, that this is what brought upon Hamas to come in, murder 1,200 people, decapitate babies, burn whole families alive. It's just morally repugnant. It's utter depravity, and it's shocking that journalists just accept all these kind of claims at face value instead of just simply asking. Hamas calls for Israel's destruction and the Jewish people to be on the receiving end of a genocide. For or against? It's a simple question. Nobody's asking it. How is that possible?
Yeah, and I mentioned, I don't know if you heard it because it was when we were having the connection issues, but this is not an example of someone inadvertently using a loaded word or someone who accidentally uses something, which, for example, I didn't have a lot of experience when I started out in media writing about Indigenous issues. So there were times when I would accidentally use the wrong term for something and someone would say, hey, Andrew, this is what you should do, and you correct it and you move on. We're not talking about, in CBC's case, an example of that because they literally laid out their policy in writing for us to see.
Exactly. And look, there are people that they interview who use, lexicon like resistance.
Mm-hmm.
Palestinians are entitled to resistance. Resistance, that's a euphemism for terror. It's a euphemism for suicide bombings. And I saw a report a couple of minutes ago in the past 10 minutes, I think there's a dozen Hezbollah paraglide terrorists who are trying to go into Israel and attack. And are we going to see people saying, oh, well, that's legitimate. It's justifiable. Look, they're trying to end the occupation now. And that's the statement some people are making are, look, it's been 75 years of occupation, 75 years. What you're actually saying is that Israel fundamentally has no right to exist. But our journalists are not pushing back against these claims. They're accepting it at face value. Perhaps because they're willing and agreeable. Other times they're ignorant. Either way, it's unacceptable.
Well, I know you are doing a great job keeping them honest, as your name suggests. Honest Reporting Canada, Mike Fegelman. Thank you so much for coming on, Mike.
My pleasure, Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.